Thank you all for joining. This is my assessment webinar, and hopefully you will find it to be really helpful as you go forward to both assess your own HR function and share the results of that assessment with your leadership team. One of the first questions I get asked all the time is, what's the difference between an audit and an assessment? And essentially, an audit is more of an examination. It's when you come in and you really are just looking at information so that you can better assess your organization. In an assessment, you are actually looking at measurement. So when we refer to an assessment, technically we're talking about having benchmark data, maybe having data from last year. So we are truly comparing it to something else. So that's the difference technically between an audit and an assessment. Now, I find in the real world that these two things are fairly interchangeable. So what kind of audits are there? Sometimes we just undertake a compliance audit. Sometimes we're really looking for best practices. We're trying to identify what's really happening in our organization and how that relates to other pieces of the business. Sometimes we're looking to audit the strategic function of human resources to make sure that what we're doing is aligned with the strategic function of our business. And finally, we often find that it's relevant to do a functional audit. A functional audit would be the kind of thing where you decide, for example, to only audit your recruiting function or to only audit comp and benefits, for example. So those are the different kinds of audits you may choose to take on. Now, I encourage people that a complete audit is really looking at all these things. You're combining all these pieces into one full document. But I think we as busy business people have to give ourselves permission to sometimes split it up over the course of a year, for example. So you may choose to tackle different parts of your audit or your assessment throughout the next calendar year. Now, one thing that's really important is that you realize that when you do an assessment, any information that's uncovered could be discoverable in a legal proceeding. So what are the steps in the assessment? And I think that this is really important. All too often, we jump in and we start doing our I-9s and looking over them and checking out to make sure that they're done properly. When we do an assessment or an audit, we really want to make sure that we have got a process that makes sense. And this is the process that I subscribe to, that I recommend can be very effective in your own organizations. So what's the purpose? The purpose is the first step in our process. Your purpose may simply be to prevent legal action, and that's fine. Sometimes I find the purpose is to educate yourself and your managers, or just to get to know the HR function better. Often, we see an assessment or an audit occurring during a merger or an acquisition, or something where you have just become responsible for other HR functions in your organization. Certainly, it can be very effective as a baseline for future evaluation. So you may use your assessment so that a year from now, or your audit, a year from now, you can come back and have that be an assessment. Often, the purpose of this is to standardize practices across your business units. Is your head of engineering doing the same thing as your head of operations? Often we find through an audit that that's not happening. It may be a diagnostic tool for yourself. The next step is to really define the scope. So just how far into the organization are you going to go with this? Are you going to just look at record keeping that you have available in your own domain? Are you going to look at compliance that has to do possibly with your finance department in the payroll function? Are you going to be looking at functional areas as defined by the HR department or as managed by the HR department? Or are you going to be looking at functional areas and how those areas interact with the other parts of your business? Sometimes the scope is going to have to do with equity among a particular team or department. And then finally, what is your engagement level going to be? So the reason defining the scope is so important at the beginning is to make sure that you have the buy-in from the leadership team, that you may be sticking your hands in other areas and you have the authority to be able to go ahead and do that. So defining the scope and getting buy-in from your leadership team is a really important second step of your assessment. I often find that what we're doing is all these things. So as we talk about the process, I think these are the very 5 critical points that you want to include. First, at the bottom left, we have here making a decision of who's going to lead the process. What will success look like? It's important that you define before you begin what is a successful audit. Next step is determining what data points you do in fact need to collect. You want to make sure as part of the process you're engaging other internal partners. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally, understanding what your specific considerations are. Consider the resources that might be available to you. I think it's important to look at both external and internal resources. Externally, you may choose to include an employment attorney. Consider also using a human resource consultant. Other trusted advisors might be somebody from your benefits company. HR peers, I think, is something to really consider. We do not enough count on each other in the HR community. And then finally, EPLI is Employment Practices Liability Insurance. So then let's move over to the thought of internal resources. Certainly you can do this yourself. There's really no reason something like, for example, an I-9 audit, if that's all you were going to undertake, that you can't just go through and do that on your own. But consider also using other members of the HR team. So certainly the person who fills out the I-9s on a regular basis shouldn't necessarily be the person who's doing that I-9 audit. A lot of our partners in the finance area, and some people on the call may actually be financial professionals, are very knowledgeable in HR, and they may be able to help you. And then finally, I see in many organizations that have, for instance, an ISO certification, they may have a quality team in place that can actually come in and do the audit as an inside outsider. So the next step in the process is data collection. This is where you start to amass the things that you need and that will ultimately help you determine where you're going to go with your recommendations and actions. So step 1 in collection data is devising that initial questionnaire. Then give thought to which project team members can help get some of those different things. They're not all going to be internal within your organization. Then invite the participants. I cannot tell you how many times I have gone off to do data collection and absolutely scared people to death. Let them know what you're doing, what your goals are. At the same time, you can certainly request the documents you need and think about starting to access those benchmarking sources very early on. And then really determine up front if certain items are just not available or they are going to be so cumbersome to find. How important is it really that you have those items? Your employee handbook is certainly a piece of every audit that I think you need to go back and look at every year. You want to make sure that every employee is getting one. Now, these days, most employees will access their handbook via the internet, and that's absolutely fine. You just want to make sure that all employees know where it is and how to access the relevant policies. Some of you may not even have a handbook written out as a single document. There may just be a compilation of policies on your intranet. And that's perfectly legal as long as all employees have signed off that they know where to find that document and how to print it if they have any questions. So as we talk about completing an audit, I like people to consider these practices as the really essential policies that need to be in your handbook. Working with your IT department is a key part of any audit as we go forward. You want to make sure that your payroll data is both accessible and retained, and understand how you are using that data to write reports and who has access to it. BYOD, I just talked about a minute ago, that stands for Bring Your Own Device. I will tell you that most of you on the call likely do not have BYOD policies. I find in organizations that most do not yet, but understand now is the time they've got to start talking about it. So as we talk about creating action items from the audit or assessment, I am really going to encourage you right now to put that on your list of action items that need to get done. Tracking of emails is something that I see in clients as a huge issue all the time. So really talk to your IT department about how those things are being stored and retained and your ability to access them in the future. And then finally, website monitoring. Really think about which websites people are going into and what you want to turn on and what you want to turn off. One of the things that I think is really important to talk about as we talk about auditing various parts of the HR function is auditing your vendor relationships. So often we undertake an agreement with a vendor and we sign up for things that later in the relationship we don't need, or we passed up on services, possibly because of cost, that are more critical today or have come down in price on their side. So really make sure that you consider part of your audit and assessment to also audit your vendors and your relationship with your vendors. Start by understanding their capabilities and make sure that you have set expectations with your vendor and you are benchmarking them against those expectations so that you really understand that in fact you're getting what you're paying for. You should be doing this every single year with your vendors in terms of an assessment. And I think it's equally as important to look for every 3 years. Now, don't do this with every vendor on the same cycle. I encourage you to rotate through so that every year, maybe you're looking at the competition of your payroll company. Next year, it might be your benefits vendor. The year after, it might be your 401k provider. But you want to conduct a full request for proposal every 3 years on your HR vendors because you want to be able to see what others in the marketplace are offering, make sure that the pricing you're paying is still in fact a fair price for the service, and most importantly, I think, just hear what other advancements different vendors are making out in the market, you may find that your own vendor can do exactly the same thing. You just never asked and they didn't bring it up to the table. So I think as we talk about audits and assessments, we have to remember to look a little bit externally as well as our internal house. And this may be, for some of you, the only audit you undertake this year is an audit of all your vendors and really see if you're getting a fair price for what you're paying. Ultimately, as we talk about the assessment process, I think it's really important that we talk about keeping it alive. And you want to make sure that this is something that you do on an ongoing basis, that essentially it becomes a natural part of your HR process. And this is why I started the program off with helping you think about how to segment this, because obviously you're not going to do a full HR assessment every year. Not only is it not realistic, it's really not necessary. But if you think about breaking that HR assessment up into different units, then you want to make sure that you're constantly evaluating these various pieces. So the idea of this slide is to ask you to think about, what are you going to do immediately? After you finish your assessment, now this is not for today, this is once the assessment or audit is finished, what are those immediate actions you're going to take? What do you need to come back and look at 3 months later? So it may be something, let's go back to our I-9s where you have a very quick fix. Somebody wasn't filling out a particular box. You've now asked that person to fill out that box. Well, 3 months after delivery, you want to go in and check and make sure they're doing it. Same with 6 months after delivery. You want to make sure that you've got a couple of those action items that you're looking at. And then annually go back and revisit not only all the work you've done this year, but what didn't you do that you'd like to take on next year. And it may be that you put your vendors off till 2016, or you do one vendor this year, one vendor next year. But I think that this is a really good way to think about keeping your assessment alive. So as we wrap up our time together today, these are just in summary points, some of the things I want you to think about. Really consider using external resources, both using your employment attorney to protect you from some of that liability, and then people like other HR peers or your trusted advisors that can help take some of this work off your plate. Make sure you're setting realistic expectations, not only for the action items you're going to uncover, but for yourself as you start on this process. If you're a very small HR department or you don't have a lot of resources, maybe start with just a very high-level compliance audit and do some of the deeper dive work in future years. Make sure that when you create those action items, you have realistic goals. One of my mantras as I talk to groups is really helping HR people elevate their careers. And if that's going to be what you're going to be doing, you want to make sure that whatever you put out there that you're going to be responsible for, that you truly are able to live up to those commitments. Do download the checklist. I'm going to show you on the next slide. I'll give you the website. The checklist is a 4-page HR assessment of everything you should be looking for. And for some of you on the call that are super skilled HR people, you may be able to go through some of these things in your head. But what I think is really interesting is when you start involving others in the process and you start to understand whether or not things that you assume everybody is doing in a particular way, if they're really doing that. Consider taking this slowly at first. When I worked in the world of consulting, my HR assessments as a deliverable were typically somewhere between 50 and 70 pages of information. Now, we did a deep dive audit into all parts of HR functions, and so that's why I consider asking you to take this slowly. Think about one functional area or one part of the assessment process that you start with to really get your feet wet and understand what this is all about. And certainly, as I said, feel free to reach out to me as you go through this process. Hopefully, those of you on the call are getting my blog, my weekly information of HR. Thank you very much. It was great to see everybody.